Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or of fears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caress and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender to those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, with a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe our dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each bearing after their own time the sacred impress, not of Caesar, but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general congress of women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its objects to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. That was what has since come to be known as the Mother's Day Proclamation. It was published in 1870 by the Unitarian writer Julia Ward Howe. Her call to action ushered into the American consciousness the holiday of Mother's Day, which, as you can see, was not initially or explicitly about celebrating the virtues and joys of mothers and motherhood. In fact, this holiday was originally conceived of and known as International Mother's Day for Peace. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. Julia Ward Howe wrote that proclamation as the cost in human lives of the American Civil War became real in the American understanding. And the proclamation makes a kind of bookend for Julia Ward Howe, marking the end of an arc of consciousness for her. For roughly 10 years prior to its publication, the publication of this proclamation, Julia Ward Howe had written the song to which many of those lives marched to their death. She wrote the battle hymn of the Republic. So there's an old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Or maybe it's, may you live an interesting life. Either way, Julia did both. And this at a time when many Unitarian lights shone brightly in this country. Hers blazed as bright as any of them. She was born in 1819 to an upper middle class family. And in the course of her lifetime, she associated with several of the Unitarian transcendentalists, with Charles Dickens, with Margaret Fuller, and many prominent Unitarian ministers such as James Freeman Clarke. She became a poet and an author, and her poems many times had to do with critiques of women's roles as wives, and critiques of her own marriage, and critiques of women's place in society. Motherhood among those places. Among her many writings and books was a novel that she never saw published because it outraged her husband. In fact, the book would have been lost to us, but that it was discovered in a box of her personal items in a library at Harvard in 1977 by a grad student doing some research. It was finally published in 2004. After being edited by the House scholar Gary Williams, it was titled The Hermaphrodite, and it tells the story of Lawrence, a scholar who lives sometimes as a man and sometimes as a woman. It was written around 1846. This is a bold woman and an honest woman. Because due to the social structures of her day, that boldness and that honesty also made her an unhappy woman. For as bold as she was also trapped in an awful marriage to a man who behaved abhorrently toward her and her art. She wrote, "I have never known my husband to approve of any act of mine which I myself valued. Books, poems, essays, everything has been contemptible or contraband in his eyes." The one place where they found commonality was in the abolitionist movement. And while that commonality was urgent, it did not redeem their marriage. Ever the radical, Julia Ward Howe supported John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. And it was to the requiem tune of John Brown's body that she wrote the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The publication of this song brought her literary fame, which you can imagine did not please her husband, and coincided with the birth of her last child. And this was an event which she described as an emancipation for her. Which brings us to Mother's Day. Julia Ward Howe was not the ideal mother. She was, it seems, somewhat reluctant in the role and awkward in its operation. And she knew it. "In giving life to others," she wrote, "do we lose our own vitality and sink into dimness, nothingness, and living death?" There's a Hallmark card for you. Dear Mom, on this special day, I want to thank you for living death. Careful of the chocolates. She also fretted, did Julia Ward Howe, that she could not relate to her children. Though, as she wrote that originally, the could not relate to was rather do not love. I'm afraid I do not love my children. She crossed that out and later went back and wrote, cannot relate to. The war changed her, not necessarily to become a different kind of mother, but where she was once a militant abolitionist, she emerged from the war a passionate pacifist. And perhaps in support of that role, she then took up the banner of the suffragists. And she worked at the pinnacle of that movement with the likes of Susan B. Anthony to secure the vote for women. This dynamic woman, this self-reflective woman, became the first woman elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And she left us with a legacy that is not easy to simplify. A model whose mold keeps changing and is never quite whole. And a holiday that was not what she intended. So Julia Ward Howe's life had its share of irony. She was a pacifist who wrote the battle hymn of the Republic. A fierce abolitionist who did not believe in racial equality. An imperfect mother who created Mother's Day. But in some ways, from a certain perspective, that's kind of fitting, right? I mean, mothers are many things, but they're not perfect. My own mother being the exception. Oh, so. As I was saying, mothers are not perfect. If nothing else, their children assure that. But we're not celebrating perfect Mother's Day. We're celebrating Mother's Day. And if it is no longer the rousing call to peace, at its heart, it is still a celebration of certain values and virtues. Perfection decidedly not among them. Virtues and values are ideals and aspirations, and embedded within ideals and aspirations is the implication of the not yet, or the not always, and the not entirely. In other words, an ideal is not a reflection of perfection. An ideal is a reflection of what we always want to be without always being it. And ideas, values, and virtues, they represent a path, not a static thing to be accomplished. If there is an accomplishment when it comes to values and virtues and ideals, it is not in reaching the path's conclusion, but simply in staying on the path. There is no conclusion. When we celebrate motherhood, we are celebrating a path and the virtues and values that make the path. And Julia Ward Howe explicitly names some of these virtues in her proclamation. So there remains some overlap. And among the virtues Howe lifted up were these: interdependence, charity, mercy, peace, tenderness, the ability to grieve, sacrifice, cooperation, and wisdom. Today we celebrate these virtues as we have seen them modeled to us so that we may in turn model them. Interdependence, charity, mercy, peace, tenderness, the ability to grieve, to sacrifice, to cooperate, and to access wisdom. And we celebrate them because they need celebrating. It's true that in some ways these virtues are their own best reward, but as we have said, they are ideals, which means a specific reward of them is infrequent and intermittent. And it won't hurt to lift them up. What we are left with most of the time is plain hard work. It's hard. Being a mom is hard. And it may have always been true, but in today's world of gender fluidity, it is now also clear that being a mom is an identity, and identity is in significant part, variably, but significantly, identity is a choice. This means that it is a choice to take up the values of mothering, which is to say, to walk the path of mothering, which is to say, to work your patience to the crumbling end of your ability. It's a commitment. Now, commitment has a cost, but it is through that commitment that one is also given immeasurable joy. The path is made by all these virtues which see us through times of trial and pain, and sometimes take us into times of trial and pain, but it is lit from time to time by immeasurable joy. It is through the work of staying on the path that one finds love. Well, not everyone. Not Julia Ward Howe, perhaps. But there is there the invitation to love, and there is there the invitation to joy, brought to us by a commitment to the ideals of interdependence, charity, mercy, peace, tenderness, the ability to grieve, to sacrifice, to cooperate, and cultivate wisdom. Commitment to the path carries us into and through love, or the other way around. Love calls us into commitment. So motherhood is a biological necessity and a socially constructed identity of responsibility, and I do not want to lose sight of that. But more broadly, it is a commitment to a path of nurturing, a path of virtues. These same virtues can be adopted by anybody, including a congregation. And I suggest to you that we may want to consider ourselves mothers of our own future as we enter into a time of transition, as we leave behind this place and enter a new place. May we as a people find inspiration in mothering and in the mothering virtues of interdependence, charity, mercy, peace, tenderness, the ability to grieve, sacrifice, cooperation, wisdom, and joy. It's a choice. It's a commitment. And with love as our guide, may it be our identity.